Right about now, I'm wishing there was some nativity in my story, but there is not. Some of my closest family members are strangers. My father was 51 years old when I was born. I came out of the womb an aunt, but I didn't grow up with my nieces and nephews or my half-sisters or my father. When my father was much younger, he had had a job stirring vats of asbestos for Johns Manville. And so he died of cancer of the lung lining a week after my 9th birthday. Up until the point that he got sick, we had lived on this island in a river outside of Sacramento called Vieira's Resort. And so most of my memories of my father involve water, involve him taking the family clamming and trapping crayfish and letting me steer the boat that he had built down the river. Then right after we had moved to rural southwestern Wyoming, my father became ill. And here my memories of him get a little foggy. I remember someone in his hospital room in Salt Lake City putting me in a closet because it was after visiting hours and they wanted to make sure that I didn't get in trouble. And I remember my mother being admitted to the same hospital at the same time as my father with cervical cancer. And I don't remember a whole lot else from that time. After my father died, I remember feeling guilt that my grief wasn't profound enough and complex enough. I mean, my teenage years sucked, but they do for most of us. And my mother had tried really hard to make sure that I felt loved and supported. But then in my early adulthood, just out of nowhere, I had this deep feeling of this absence of my father. And I wanted to hear more about him. So I started this letter writing campaign. This was before email and before phone calls were free. And so I was handwriting letters to his family asking for stories about my dad, which I got, but they did very little to patch that hole. And so almost immediately, I launched a second letter writing campaign to his family. And this time I asked about moving his remains from Salt Lake City, where none of us lived and none of us cared to visit, and doing a scattering of his ashes at sea, on the water that meant so much to him. And this time, the reaction was negative. There was concern that it was illegal, and concern that it was expensive, and mostly a sense that because my father was a humanist and he believed that life was for the living, that he just wouldn't have cared. And so ostensibly, I just let it go. But I'm this incessant list maker. And so for years, as I would scribble down my to-dos, at the top would be move Dad's ashes, over quit smoking, over lose 15 pounds, over learn Spanish. But I still didn't do anything about it. Until I was living in Denver, I was in my 30s, and I get this telephone call from my favorite uncle, my dad's youngest brother, Charles. He was going to be in Salt Lake City for a competitive bridge tournament, and he wanted to go and visit the columbarium where my father's ashes were. So he's just calling me to get the name. And this was the first time I realized that I didn't actually know where in Salt Lake City my father's ashes were. And by this time there was email, so I emailed the family and I said, can you tell me the name of the columbarium where my dad's ashes are? And none of us knew. And yes, my dad was a humanist, and I agree that life is for the living. But I'm an agnostic with atheistic leanings, and it was still important to me, and I was one of the living. So I launched my third campaign to make my dad less of a stranger to me. And I started calling every columbarium and mortuary in Salt Lake City. And apparently record keeping isn't super important to these people. So I heard a whole lot of, I don't know, and well, you can come take a look around. But I finally got a sympathetic ear. And this man said that, no, my father's ashes were not at his mortuary. However, what could I remember of the day of my father's memorial service? What did I remember of the surroundings? And I told him what I thought I remembered of sloping hills and scattered trees and a nearby Marie Callender's. And I don't even know if any of that's true. But this lovely stranger got on the phone to his colleagues, and within a week, he had located my father's remains. So I filled out the reams of paperwork and spent the hundreds of dollars, they were right, it was expensive, and had my father's remains shipped to me in Denver. And Eric Isle and myself took my dad's remains and got into our Prius that would not make the return trip home. And we went out to Vieira's resort and met up with my mother and her partner and my half-sisters and my nieces and my nephews. And we scattered my father's remains into that river where he had taken us clamming, and he had trapped crayfish, and he had let me steer the boat that he had made down the river. And the coda to this story is that my mother and her partner are here tonight. They drove out from California because I asked them to. And because of my mother's lead, my mother, Eric Isle, and I all now have advanced directives that leave our bodies to science and our ashes to the sea. Thank you.